really important part of what End Abuse Long Beach offers to the community, and so we're so excited that we have CEUs, and all of that is because of Teal Bay's tremendous work. So on behalf of the End Abuse Long Beach Board and those of you our members, and we'd like to give you a little token of our appreciation. It was very nice to be able to make that announcement this month instead of the one we've been making for the last 6 months about we didn't know. But thank you again, Jill. Thank you. So now, as we talked about when we first got in here, today is a little bit of a special program. We're in roundtables, and it's going to be a very interactive program this morning versus the usual speaker training. So I'd like to introduce our 2 co-facilitators for today's program. First, we have, you've already met Dr. Michele Winterstein. Those of you who've worked in Long Beach definitely know that she is the Executive Director of For the Child. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with over 30 years experience, and she doesn't need much introduction. Like I said, if you've worked in Long Beach, you know what great work Dr. Winterstein's doing in this community for children. Our second co-facilitator is Vicki Doolittle, who is the Executive Director of Sukasa. She's worked both in Sukasa and in the shelter in Long Beach, but she's also worked really closely with End Abuse Long Beach to make sure that we're part of the larger community councils. So she's done great work for domestic violence victims. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Winterstein and Vicki Doolittle to take over.
Thank you. So this has been really fun to get a chance to work with Vicki. And I was thinking about the fact, most of you probably know that in the early 70s, this was the first child abuse council in the state of California. And in the mid-90s, the Long Beach Child Trauma Council merged with the Domestic Violence Prevention Council through the work of Paula Cohen. And I had been chair of the Trauma Council in 1990, and I came kicking and screaming to this. Paula had to convince me that bringing together child abuse and domestic violence was a really good thing to do. There were some lunches, there was some having coffee, kind of talking it through behind the scenes. And this merger, our child abuse and domestic violence councils coming together to create End Abuse in the mid-90s was a very innovative step. And so historically, the fact that we're revisiting this topic, I think is significant. And I'm going to do a very quick pass through some of the research, just to frame it a little bit. And then we're going to talk about, Vicki's going to give some quick analysis of where we're at, and then we're going to break into small groups for discussion of 7 questions that we've identified. We don't expect every table's going to get to all 7. We want you to look at the 7, pick the 3 or 4 that grab you in terms of who's around your table, and we're going to then have you come up and put some of your ideas on the board. And again, I have to say, I'm old school and used to calling it domestic violence. I still stumble over inter-partner violence. I get it wrong all the time, so if you'll bear with me. But one of the most important studies that I think that we need to pay attention to is that in the first 6 months of life, if you have a baby that's in a family with domestic violence, they have significantly higher risk for physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and other forms of child abuse in the first 5 years of life. It's a very critical risk factor. I can't really see the screen, so I'm going to turn away. There are many, many studies, and I don't have them all up there, but those of you that are into the research literature know that for years there's been research literature about the co-occurrence and that domestic violence in a family is a significant risk factor for other forms of maltreatment. Depending on whose studies you look at, 30 to 60% overlap. And those are mostly child welfare studies, DCFS involvement. It's harder to get data on general population, so a lot about what we know about this is from child welfare studies. But interestingly, a lot of this research was done in the 90s. Some of the best research on child abuse and domestic violence co-occurrence was in the 1990s, right at the time when our councils were merging. It was an innovative concept to look at how these come together in families and how our systems could respond more effectively. Children of battered women reported for other kinds of abuse, 6 times more often than children with homes without DV. Again, the data, it's like whose studies are you reading, but there's a lot of consistency in these. I remember hearing Lenore Walker back in the 80s, and one of the things she said was that children had an 8 times greater risk if they were growing up in a family with domestic violence. That was very controversial at the time. It was that battered women were 8 times more likely to abuse their children. And that was very controversial. I remember being at some conferences where Lenore Walker spoke, and this was like the child abuse and domestic violence people in the room. I thought were going to have a civil war over, the whole victim blaming, concern about how do you deal with battered women who are just trying to get safe themselves, and then you're focusing on them being abusers, potentially abusers to their children. And who does the abuse? What we know from the studies that are out there, about half the time, the perpetrator of the inter-partner violence is also the person abusing the child. 35% of the time, it's the battered woman who's also abusing or seriously neglecting the child, and about 15% of the time it's both. So the kids are getting that abuse from both parties. And I think the underreporting issue is really significant, because there was a very interesting child welfare study where 9% of the social workers said that the social workers said that 9% of the women in their current caseloads, their child abuse caseloads, were domestic violence victims. And when they surveyed those women, about 40% of those women reported domestic violence, and 30% had had domestic violence within the past 12 months from the time the child abuse was reported. So what that says to me is what we see all the time. I mean, we'll have people disclose to us in therapy that they're victims of domestic violence, and then all of a sudden when DCFS gets involved or when law enforcement gets involved, it's retracted. And they don't share that information with the authorities for lots of different reasons that we all know. So the underreporting is significant, and it keeps us from having really good data. So I'm going to real quickly say that there's tons of research out there. All this research in the 90s led to a very important study that was done, I think, in 1999 by the Department of Justice. And it led to about 5 years, it led to a piece of work, the National Judicial Council did a piece of work, I think we called it the Green Book, that had a lot of recommendations. It led to about 5 years of pilot studies funded by Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Division. And then all of a sudden, it stops. There's not as much research on this topic. There's not as much investment of federal dollars in trying to bring together a response to child abuse and domestic violence. And Vicki and I were talking, we can't quite figure that out, other than that first 5 years of pilot study came up with variable findings across the studies, and they basically said that it was hard to keep that institutional change going. that it cost money to invest in cross-system collaborative efforts, and that changing our systems and keeping an integrated response viable took a tremendous investment of time and money, and to get things institutionalized so that it didn't just depend on people. You know, I know this person, you know this person, but when we retire or when we get promoted or we're not there anymore, it falls apart. So all of a sudden in about 2004, 2005, all this research kind of starts to become much less. And I also think the recessionary years. We moved into recessionary times when programs across the board were tightening belts and focusing on core services and trimming away, you know, some very innovative things that people were doing but that we couldn't sustain. So now I'd like to bring Vicki up, who has some observations, because we are having a reemergence of awareness of this topic.
Thank you. Well, I need to put my stuff down here, so. Yeah, I think that really, that is an excellent foundation, good framework that Dr. Winterstein has provided for us. And it is interesting because, you know, this sort of intersection, this topic was sort of new to me, so I had an opportunity to really kind of dig into the research and find out what's out there. So I just want to add a couple of comments to what Dr. Winterstein has already said. One thing that struck me when I was looking into all the reports and the briefs and so forth is that among practitioners and professionals, there really is widespread agreement as to the scope of the problem. The data is fairly consistent, as you've heard a little bit of that. And there's even agreement as to the ultimate goal, because I think we can all agree, and certainly all of the practitioners and professionals have agreed, safety for both the adult victim and for the child is the ultimate goal. So there's no disagreement about that. But where we've come into some challenges and where it's hard to find agreement is how do we get there? So what is, you know, what is the strategy? And there were multiple and numerous studies. I found a lot of publications and manuals and guidebooks and on, with their principles, their recommendations, you know, their mission statements, all incredibly valuable about how to address this intersection of child abuse and domestic violence. So it's clear there is absolutely no lack of information. There's no lack of, you know, guidebooks on the topic, if you will. It was hard for me to sift through all of that and to really locate the threads that connect all of those pieces and to see which of those threads in fact connect to the work we're doing here at the local level. So I think that that's part of what we're going to make. We're going to make an effort to do that, to begin doing that today. But there is one thing also I wanted just to share with you. There's an overarching law, I think, that offers hope and funding support. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are already familiar with this, but let me just remind us. The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, was signed into law in 2010, and it directly addresses the overlap of domestic violence and child abuse. And it provides for an increased emphasis on exactly what we're talking about, the collaboration between and among agencies. And included in the reauthorization of CAPTA was the reauthorization of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which I know many of us are very familiar with, because this happens to be the only source of dedicated funding for victims of domestic violence and children. And it supports the majority of the nation's DV shelters. I know Sukasa receives this funding. I'm pretty sure that just about every other shelter does as well. One other last comment that I want to make before we start our exercise, which I hope you're all getting really excited about, because it's kind of going to be fun. Here's a real interesting coincidence. The LA County Shelter Directors recently took a poll to see how many open DCFS cases we had in our agencies from the period of time from January through March of 2016. Now, we didn't have a huge response, but 8 shelters responded, which may be representative, and we discovered that we averaged 22.75 open DCFS cases, with a range from 5
all the way to 70. So it happens that this poll was initiated by the Committee for Systems Improvement on the DV Council for LA County. And my understanding is that they were doing this to convince DCFS that they need to train their staff on DV and to work more closely with DV agencies. So I just thought that was so fascinating. It's anybody's guess what the ultimate outcome is going to be and where this is all going to be going. But I thought that would, and that I just received that email this week. So it's kind of interesting segue into our exercise and our presentation this morning. So, all right, so as professionals and practitioners in a variety of violence prevention organizations, we consider you the experts. And we're interested in exploring with you this morning what you are all seeing in your day-to-day work when you see this intersection or you encounter this intersection of domestic violence and child abuse. So we want to engage you. We want to get you to be, talk and discuss among yourselves. As Dr. Winterstein said, we've put together 7 questions. And some of them are pretty long, so you're going to want to take time with these questions and really read through each one and determine which ones seem best suited for those of you sitting around your table. Now, if you want, you can move to another table, but I don't know, any way you want to do it. But we have 7, and I put, 7 pieces of poster paper up there on the mirror. So the idea here is for each of you to contribute to a very fruitful discussion, decide which of these questions you want to address in the time you have, select a spokesperson, because one person will be reporting out at the end of the exercise. You're also going to be writing down as succinctly as you can, but there are 2 sheets up on the board there. Writing down the most, what you consider the most significant points that your group has come up with in response to the questions. Okay? Let's see, what have I forgotten? Is there?
You need to hand out the questions.
Oh, the questions. There they are. We have them right here. Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to look at the time. Again, we're breaking ground here at End Abuse because we've not done this format before, so we're going to kind of structure it as we go. But I'm thinking probably 15 to 20 minutes for you to discuss these questions as a group. And I think that should give you ample time to come up with several good responses that you would want to share with the rest of us. You'll notice that each of the poster papers up on the board pertains to one of the questions on your sheet. It's front and back too. So you will be responding, depending on which question you choose, on the appropriate poster. There's a marker in the middle of each table. So we're going to give you, like I said, I think we have.
Did everybody get questions? Anybody missing?
It seems like we have time for 20 minutes.
Oh, please.
At least 20. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll give you 20 minutes. I'll give you a 2-minute warning so you can start wandering over and recording some of your responses.
And if you're not in a group, please join a group.
We addressed questions 3 and 4. On question 3, the failure to protect issue, we talked about education and training. The question is about communication between the various systems with failure to protect. And when we were talking about education, we were talking about the frustration that it doesn't matter who you train, they get moved on, and then there's somebody else who hasn't been trained. So it happens with the police and it happens with DCFS. And it used to be we'd go to roll call or something and train different groups and then different officers would be there. So it's just I don't know that there's any answer to that. We just have to keep training. But we also talked about educating clients to understand what their responsibility and role is in the whole system, and that yes, they are being challenged to do things that maybe are not comfortable for them or maybe is even too much for them to be able to do, but they have to understand that they are being tested to see that you're willing to cooperate, participate, step up, show that you care more about the children's safety than about the abuser or whoever. So we also talked about generally relationship building and communication between the various partners. So that's number 3. And then on number 4, we were looking at the depression that the victims go through, their inability to cope with the various things, and how sometimes they crash when they get to shelter or when they get services. Suddenly their behavior is worse, not better, because they're available and able to release that stress and that tension. We were talking about children preschool age, how important it is for them to have licensed childcare programs or after-school programs for school-age kids, so that they're out in the community and visible for people to help and notice that they need help, and also to give, the moms a break that they need. And the moms need, obviously, mental health treatment and support groups to combat the isolation, the depression, to recognize and acknowledge the guilt that they have, and to help them to start to heal. So, brilliant.
Terrific, thank you. Great start. I think Michelle's getting most of those. Who would like to go next? Okay, then I'm going to walk around and choose someone. Who's your spokesperson at this table? Oh, okay, great.
She just got appointed.
Hi, everybody. We mostly just talked about question number 6 and then got so fixated on that we never moved on. And in that, trying to understand the question, because we went a little sidetracked as well. Helping police and first responders, just looking at the bigger picture of everything, and this is something I'm going to talk about next week at that event that Michele mentioned. So, as a prosecutor, we're looking at when police bring the case to us, what evidence do we have? And police, they have their specific job too, and their job is to basically to investigate a crime. And so, unfortunately, I think a lot of what gets lost in that when they're doing an investigation is they're very focused on, making sure they speak to the right people, identify the evidence, and things that could be addressed at that time, like interviewing children, looking to see what kind of injuries they have, looking to see who else is in the house, would be not only helpful for us when we're looking at the situation, because it's a bigger picture thing, and the cycle of violence is very much, as we all know in this room, continuous. If the parents are abusing each other, it's very likely that children are getting abused, and then same goes for when the children grow up, they tend to become the victims of abuse and domestic violence, or the abusers themselves. And so, anyways, back to the point. Somebody at our table mentioned that, or actually a couple people did, that when the police respond, if we could have maybe more of a team
That's what we were saying.
that went out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that included not just police officers who have to do their job, and it's a very stressful and difficult job, and I think that's even noted in the question. But also, I guess one of the people at our table was saying that in San Diego they have a marriage family therapist who's also a trained police officer who will go out with situations like that. That would be amazing. Somebody who's there for those purposes, or somebody who would be there to be able to help them seek the medical attention or the restraining orders that they need, or things like that. Because the police have some knowledge, but that's not their main goal.
Stephanie, do you think we need to train the DART team on how to screen the kids?
Probably.
If DART's already in place and responding, do we train DART on some of these issues?
I think they need to be trained, and then also maybe people with different kinds of backgrounds added to that, expanding it would be helpful. So just the more details, the better, and the more help that people have, I think, at the onset of the incident also better, because that's when people are more honest because they're vulnerable and they're going through that situation right at that time and realizing that they need the help where, later on, as we know, like it changes. Oh, yeah, and also another main point was that a lot of times, Alicia and I do misdemeanors. We don't see DART or these kind of response teams going out for these cases because they're smaller cases than felonies. But that is really where the root of this stuff begins: the push, the scratch, the quick choke, and getting people out there sooner and this kind of awareness and help sooner. We would hope help stop the cycle of violence, especially for the kids in the future.
Thank you. Excellent. Good job. Who would like to be the spokesperson at this table? Everyone's pointing at somebody else. Just a couple of points.
Okay, so we talked about number 4 and number 7, and maybe I can speak to number 4. So we talked about how victims of domestic violence, they experience depression, numbness, and self-medicate, and specifically when they have 50-50 custody with the perpetrator and are constantly seeing the perpetrator every week, and how that just reinforces some of that behavior that they're looking to cope. We talked about safe handoffs at police stations, using supportive family members.
So are you saying the 50-50 custody keeps them engaged in the relationship?
Right.
Or
Right. They have to continuously have contact with each other, and there's also the manipulation that goes on in between the partners with the children, and the children saying things about mom or saying things about dad that are hurtful or untrue.
So re-victimization.
Right.
And in regards to number 7, we were talking about how, well, especially, it's just kind of looking out of the box. I know that we, as a domestic violence agency, we have so much to do in our plate. We only have a limited window of time a lot of the time, and it's really, really hard for us to tackle all of the major problems. But in us with dealing with local law enforcement, we've developed programs where they've been able to call us after every single DV call they've had, and we follow up with them 3 times. In our experience of doing this for over, I want to say 15 years or plus, we've noticed that the first time that we call the victim, they will be non-responsive. They don't want to know. They just hang up automatically because they're scared. They don't know what's going on. And we've realized that these victims, most of the time, they need time to process what's going on. They need to figure out what they want to do, how they're going to do it, because everything's changed so fast for them. Most of the times that perpetrators out of the home and they were the breadwinner, now they're faced with, how am I going to take care of my kids? Where am I going to live? What am I going to do? The rent is due next week. And so when we call the second time, they're kind of more willing to find out, okay, so who are you? What do you do? What do you provide? By the third call, I would say our success rate is about 85% of the victim actually coming in and getting any of the services. We've also talked about and discussed how it's been a big challenge for, we know that a lot of the times the victims are females, they're the mothers of the children, but we've seen more cases now that it's actually the fathers, the males that are getting resources, going out and seeking domestic violence resources for their situation. And we've seen in our experience that it's more of a challenge for males to actually go out and ask for the services, and the legal system and everything. We sometimes make it nearly impossible for them to actually get the services or get them the help, because we tend to go to the female side or the mother and help them as much as possible. We had a situation where the male for 5 years tried to get custody of these kids, and through, fighting the legal system, he was able to get 80-20. And it was unbelievable because the mom had so many chances. She was arrested 3 times for drugs and alcohol, and still after those 3 arrests, it took 5 years for him to get these children. So I think a lot of times we make it harder on individuals that are trying to get the custody of the kids, and so we're putting those kids continuing to put these kids in a very dangerous situation.
Do you find it challenging to get shelter care for men with children?
Well, we are able to provide that, and a lot of we don't get a lot of those requests. I would say we've seen more cases recently, maybe because we're working more closely with the center in Long Beach, that we get the same-sex situation. But a lot of the males themselves, I could probably think of 2 cases off the top of my head that have actually come into to live at our shelter for a very short time. I mean, they will not even stay the 30 days.
Thank you, Lorena. I just want to add that an interesting thing at Sukasa, we just accepted our first male victim into our transitional shelter, which is the 3 to 6 month program. So that was very new to us, but it does happen. Has anyone responded to questions 1, 2, or 4? Because we don't have anything on the board now. Did you do?
Oh, no, I said they just did 4.
I'm sorry. Oh, it's 5. I'm sorry. 1, 2, or 5. And if not, that's okay. Who's your spokesperson at this table?
These guys.
Thank you. We did questions 3 and 6. So some of the main points that we talked about for question 3 was shifting the lens of DCFS and putting it in more of a positive frame to, of course, avoid the issue of re-victimization, but putting it in the sense that this is an outside agency that is able to come in and help you. If we're coming from, which we all should be, the trauma-informed lens and looking at the fact that possibly this victim, whether it's male or female, of this interpersonal violence situation, possibly was a victim of some kind of abuse coming during their childhood. So by all means, trying to avoid that re-victimization point, but still coming from the lens of you didn't get the help that you needed at that point, so hopefully we can get this other agency in to help you and create a better foundation for you and your children, and not to put it in terms of a punitive punishment type of situation. But we were saying that is a long process in making sure that we're all working together, all the agencies in this room, all the agencies that we're connected with outside of here, so that we can all work together to change that lens. Because the retired DCFS person that we have here, she came from the the field when it was very negative to bring up DCFS, and no one wanted to involve them because you're a bad parent, you're neglecting your children, and we have to get these other people to come in and show you how to parent your child. And collaboration and advocacy were 2 of the main points that we also brought up as far as collaborating with the other agencies, as we said. And then advocating, what were we saying? Well, advocacy is what we stand for, so I don't remember why I wrote that down, but that was just one of the main points that we brought up. So that was number 3. And then for number 6, very similar to what some of the other people have said, as far as giving more training to the DART team and encouraging them to have proper training or proper checking of the infants and not just kind of eyeballing whatever it is that you're seeing. So not necessarily doing a in-depth investigation or checking like the pediatricians would do, but looking more so at, okay, this is what I'm seeing now, possibly having some interagency conversations with the pediatricians, seeing if there's a history of the sentinel injuries to get a more comprehensive understanding and view of what's been going on for this family. And then what she said as well is having the social workers, MFTs on the team that the police officers can call and consult with to see if this is something else that we should further look into or take further action or further steps with. And then also identifying prevention services, which one of our members mentioned, so that it doesn't have to get to the DCFS level and that you can stop it kind of at the misdemeanor level or stop it before it gets to the more serious point of intervention.
Well, I know that Kim would want me to stop at this point and say, we have two more actually, that it is 9:30, right? So I guess what we can do is ask if you'd like to spend a couple more minutes and have the other two tables report out, or should we close and feel free to leave at this point because it is 9:30, but we do have the two more tables. Would you guys like to go? Peggy?
So I don't know if we actually answered the question, but we pretty much focused on number 2 and really talked a lot about it's not just the victim, but the family and family friends and other people who abuse children when the mother is being, or whoever is being a victim. And we just kind of got involved in talking about that a lot and about what happens in the intergenerational cycle of violence and some around what is needed. What we believe is needed is a whole lot less research and a whole lot more direct services. That would be the short and easy way to put it, is to say, you know, that if we could get places like the Office of Violence Against Women to quit funding research and start funding some services, it could make a huge difference.
Yeah, and number 2 also, and I think it across the board, we didn't have any answers, but we did raise the question about how, as practitioners, we need to be actively working on balancing the need of developing trust and confidentiality and the need of protecting the victim. And I thought back to Jim McDonald's presentation of trafficking a few months ago and how he was changing the culture of an entire department by decriminalizing the child. And I think that's what we need to be doing, whether it's, you know, through getting an effective director at an agency like that, or through good marketing or publicity in the community, rather than what we were talking about before. The only time we ever get publicity is when a child dies because of inappropriate professional activities.
Okay, moving to our final table. Who would like to?
One more table back there. Are you a table?
Do we have a table?
We were.
Tiole, I'm so sorry.
And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your first name, but Sharp?
Oh, just,
Jessica, are you
I
a
wasn't,
table?
no, I'm not a table.
Not a table.
I'll briefly touch on what Mary and I discussed. We thought for number 1 that what we've seen in the reaction when the perpetrator has abused both adult and child victims is that the child abuse is taken much more seriously and it's prioritized. And although that is understandable, what we find is that the adage we've always practiced under is that if you resource, protect, encourage, provide, support for the survivor parent, the child's situation will vastly improve. And so when we practice in that, often we're met with everyone else that we're trying to collaborate with only prioritizing the child. And that's been really difficult. We definitely thought for number 2, that we do not see a tremendous amount of physical violence, and in terms of folks that are caretakers, and that leads us into that idea in terms of failure to protect. We thought that should be erased from our system and vocabulary because it's the ultimate proof that is not a trauma-informed model, that often survivors of intimate partner violence are incredibly adaptive and creative and using all their resources and creativity to provide protective strategies. They're hypervigilant and strategizing all the time to keep their kids as safe as possible, and often those are the things that are never pointed out.
And let me respond to that, because I think I think in child abuse services, we do see a lot of moms who abuse kids where there's also domestic violence going on. So I agree with you. I think failure to protect language is not very helpful, except in a few very extreme situations.
Right, rare.
But we do a lot of talking about capacity to protect, not willingness to protect, but resources and capacity that support and protective factors that support protection, safety and protection.
But that's different language than what everybody uses.
Yeah, and so where I...
And you're going to get a different response from that survivor if you use different language about it.
So even though we may see in the child abuse treatment world, we may see more situations where there's been some physical abuse, the language, you're absolutely, I think, brilliantly on point with the trauma lens and the need to change this language.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a great...
A lot of folks, we find the adaptation is just like the one we see with oppression and groups that have historically and traditionally been marginalized, is that oftentimes there are greater extents that those parents will go to try to potentially punish behaviors in order to keep that child from getting in trouble with the larger society, authority figures, or the abusive parent. And I think we're not being trauma informed or culturally relevant in a lot of situations in terms of how that parent is trying to adapt to an untenable situation when they're being, really under control of that abuser. Yeah. And I think our last one was just for 7. Not to be in silos, we need cross-training, and I think we need less of a funder focus and more of a survivor focus. And I think that would get us away from the very siloed approach in a lot of ways, because the focus really is about how do we do this for the funders. And I'm glad to see more funders talking about trauma-informed, but I think it's a lot more talk than actually holding folks to the real concepts of that. And so the need for that cross-training is important. And I think that means putting down egos, because a lot of times, folks that are in other situations don't want to hear from the rape crisis advocate. They don't want to hear from, a medical doctor doesn't want to hear from the domestic violence counselor. And I think we have to recognize expertise in different ways so that we can understand that there's a lot that can be learned from one another so that we can collaborate more fully.
I just love the way we take these questions and the way you've amplified and just taken them to another level, Tiame. Thank you so much. Okay, we have one other table here to record. Who's going to speak?
I'll just go quickly. We did number 3, and then we talked about some of the barriers and fears behind women in terms of their barriers for not reaching out for help. So we talked a little bit about that, but then we also talked about when women do receive support from a domestic violence shelter, it's also seen as protective factors from the eyes of CPS. And so from my experience working in a DV shelter, a lot of times the children were more likely to be able to stay with the parents if they were able to leave the better and go to the shelter in order to get the safe environment, to get the counseling, the advocacy, things like that.
So, any ideas about next steps as we close? We're going to go back and type some of this up. And how would you like to have this back? How would you like to get this back to the group? Yeah. I can email it to Kim, who can share it. But I would just say Vicki and I are both, open if you have ideas about next steps. I'm always hoping when we do this that we can identify some things. I think it's really easy to start working on our language and how we talk about things through a trauma lens. I think that's low-hanging fruit. We don't have to have research studies. We don't have to have grant funds. We can just really start thinking about it. So I think there's some of these that we may be able to, that are not going to require huge policy changes or legislative changes, that we can just start saying, how do we do some cross-training to bring, like if we want to screen, make sure that when there's a response to domestic violence, that we're taking a closer look at the babies and those families, because they're, that's where the high risk is. How do we make that happen in our city? And how do we do it with minimal dollars? Because a lot of this stuff doesn't require a lot of money. It just requires rethinking how we're doing some things we're already doing. So thank you very much. And Vicki, any final comment? Thank you for having both of us. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you both. Thank you.